Back in the late 2000s, the band Opeth released a series of albums that showed a significant deviation from their sound. The album sounded more like the progressive rock bands of the 70s and less like the progressive death metal of their albums from the 90s. So was this change for the better? I've been a fan of Opeth since the release of their 2016 album Sorceress, so I discovered them with this new sound. But after that, I fell in love with the band and I listened to all their albums from the first one to the last one, and they became one of my favorite bands. So in this video, I'm going to discuss if this change in sound was for the better, and I'm going to focus on their 2014 album, Pale Communion, because I feel that this is their masterpiece from this specific time period. So as of the recording of this video, their new album, The Last Will and Testament, hasn't come out yet. And I know we all heard the single and they're bringing back the death growls. So now it would be a good time to talk about one of their masterpiece albums, which is Pale Communion. Opeth is a progressive death metal band from Sweden. They formed in 1990 and they released their debut album Orchard in 1995. Now from the beginning, they were not just a typical death metal band because they've always been known to incorporate different styles into their music, such as folk, blues, classical, and jazz. The songs have always included acoustic guitar passages and keyboards, but the majority of the sound sounded like death metal with death growls with lots of tempo changes and complex guitar riffs. This band is led by their lead vocalist, guitarist, and main songwriter, whose name is Mikael Åkerfeldt, and the band has also changed members over the years. The first hints of the band changing their sound came in the early 2000s when they decided to release two albums within a few months of each other. They were Deliverance and Damnation. This was meant to be a double album, but the record company wanted to release them separately 5 months apart from each other. Now, why is this important? Because the first album, Deliverance, showed off the band's heavier side, and the second album, Damnation, showed off the band's softer side, which made sense at the time. But Damnation is known for being the first Opeth album without the death growls, and it also had a sound similar to progressive rock bands of the 70s. Since then, they continued to release albums, and the next two albums still had that classic sound. Those two albums are probably two of their best albums. In 2005, they released Ghost Reveries, which is a great album that mixed their death metal and progressive rock influences. Then they released Watershed, which is probably one of my favorite albums by the band. And this is known as the last studio album to contain the death growls or death metal sounds. And that's not until the new album, The Last Will and Testament, which will be coming out October 11th of this year. Then in 2011, they released Heritage, and this marked the beginning of the new Opeth sound. This was more of a progressive rock album. It didn't have any death growls. It's an album that's probably considered one of their weaker ones, although Opeth has a pretty solid discography. But it probably sits towards the bottom end. Now in 2014, they followed this up with Pale Communion, and I think this is where they showed the world that they can make a progressive rock album that doesn't have death growls, has a sound similar to many progressive rock bands of the 70s, but doesn't lose the essence of Opeth. There's still that darkness that's present on the album, so for that reason I feel this is their masterpiece from that time period. It was an album that some critics loved and others didn't. I'll talk about that a little later in the video. When the morning comes. Now you may be wondering what makes Pale Communion so special. I think it has to do with the songwriting. So for example, the opening track is called Eternal Rains Will Come. And what's interesting about this track is that you don't hear any vocals until about 3 minutes into it. So you have the first 3 minutes of the song where you can enjoy all the intricate instrumentation of the song, which includes lots of different keyboards, some softer, quieter sections, a lot of odd time signatures, and they were influenced from the progressive rock bands of the 70s. The song also had some psychedelic sounds, and it's just a good way to start the album. They followed this up with Cusp of Eternity, which is one of my favorite songs. It reminds me of Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow. It had a nice driving rhythm. There's more of a focus on the guitar riffs, and they capture that Middle Eastern style that the aforementioned Ritchie Blackmore used to do with his band. They followed this up with a 10-minute epic song, which has everything. It has the progressive rock sounds, the soft classical interlude, and lots of sections where they go from the little harder rocking parts to the quieter parts. So I feel They did a good job with that one. We all know Opeth are known for including some songs that are very chill and laid back. So I would say the song Elysian Woes would fall into that category. And they followed this up with an instrumental called Goblin. This was inspired by a progressive rock band from Italy, which is a pretty cool band. They recorded a lot of film score from those old Dario Argento horror movies. It was a pretty cool progressive rock song with elements of jazz. After this is one of the most interesting Opeth songs I've ever heard, and that's called River. I say this because it reminds me of some classic rock or folk rock. One critic compared the song to Sweet Judy Blue Eyes by Crosby, Stills and Nash. So there's one point in the song that reminded me of early Genesis. I thought it was one of the best songs in the album because it shows Opeth doing something completely different. Then they have two more songs in the album. The first one, Voice of Treason, has some dark Middle Eastern sounds, and the last song, Faith in Others, has some progressive sounds and darker tones. So I think it's a solid album. It doesn't have any filler. All the songs are very good, and they all seem to work together when you listen to the album front to back. Let's talk about what some of the critics said. So I pulled up a few reviews of this album that were from 10 years ago when this album came out. The first review was from Angry Metal Guy, and he has a blog I like to read a lot. He gave this a perfect score of a 5 out of 5, and he said, one of the best sounding records I've heard in years. Then I read a review from Pitchfork, and they were a little bit more negative. They said, Opeth's first album in 3 years lacks the absolute willpower and prevailing ambition of the band's best work. And I think that goes to show that some people just weren't happy with the change in sound. So even if it was a great album, they weren't going to like it because it didn't have the death growls. Then I read a review from Loudwire, and they had some positive things to say about it. They said it's a step up from Heritage in many ways, perhaps most notably its sophistication. So was Opeth's change in sound for the better? I believe it was a bold move. I think it was something they wanted to do, but if you look at all the albums they released in that time period, it was kind of hit or miss, whereas the period before Damnation and Deliverance was a lot more consistent. I think the band really reached their peak from the late 90s into the early 2000s with albums like Morning Rise, My Arms, Your Hers, Still Life, and Blackwater Park. I think it was their peak, but I also believe their second peak came in the mid-2000s with Ghost Reveries and Watershed. As for the progressive rock period, there were 4 albums, and I think their best album from this period was this one, Pale Communion, followed by In Cauda Venenum, and the weaker ones would be Heritage and Sorceress. So it's kind of hit or miss, but with that being said, I still consider Opeth to be one of those bands that has a near perfect discography. Even if I call Heritage their worst album, it's still better than almost anything else that came out around that time. So I'm now looking forward to The Last Will and Testament. I'll review that when it comes out. I'm expecting it to be a return to their Ghost Reverie sound, but we'll have to wait. But I did review the first single from The Last Will and Testament in one of my videos for new metal releases, so I'll link that right here. And if you want to hear what I have to say about that single from the new Opeth album, you can check it out. In the meantime, thanks for watching. Please like this video. It helps me with the YouTube algorithm. Please subscribe if you have not already. I do rock and metal reviews, rankings, and more. I do classic album reviews as well. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.